The autumn rain fell like tears from an angry sky as Chenoa crouched beside the smoldering remains of her village, her small hands clutching the precious corn seeds her grandmother had pressed into her palm before the soldiers came. At 12 years old, she was the last survivor of the Chiricahua band that had called this hidden canyon home for generations. The acrid smell of smoke still hung in the air, mixing with the metallic scent of blood and the clean smell of rain on desert earth. 3 days had passed since the blue-coated soldiers had swept through their peaceful settlement like a prairie fire, destroying everything sacred her people had built. Chenoa's grandmother, Itzel, had been teaching her the ancient ways of planting when the attack began. "The corn is life," the old woman had whispered urgently as gunshots echoed through the canyon. "These seeds carry the spirit of our ancestors. As long as they grow, we survive." Now Itzel lay beneath a pile of stones Chenoa had carefully arranged, following the burial customs her grandmother had taught her. The girl's parents, her 2 brothers, her cousins, all were gone, taken by bullets or the fever that came after. She was alone in a world that seemed determined to erase every trace of Apache existence. The rain had been falling for 2 days straight, turning the desert arroyos into rushing torrents and washing away the last traces of the massacre. Chenoa's buckskin dress clung to her thin frame, and her long black hair hung in wet ropes around her shoulders. She should have been cold, should have been searching for shelter, but grief had numbed her to everything except the weight of the seeds in her hands. These weren't ordinary corn seeds. They were sacred white mountain corn, passed down through 20 generations of Apache women. Each kernel carried the genetic memory of survival, the ability to grow in harsh desert conditions where other plants withered and died. Her grandmother had told her that as long as Apache women planted these seeds, the people would endure. But what good were seeds when there were no Apache women left to plant them? Chenoa closed her eyes and tried to remember her grandmother's voice, the stories of the old days when the Apache moved freely across the vast desert, following the seasons and living in harmony with the land, before the white men came with their treaties and their lies, before the reservation system tried to cage a people who belonged to the wind and the mountains. Her band had been among the last holdouts, living in this hidden canyon far from the reservation boundaries. They had grown their corn, gathered wild plants, and lived as their ancestors had for countless generations. They had hurt no one, taken nothing that wasn't freely given by the earth. It hadn't mattered. The soldiers had come anyway, following the tracks of raiders from another band, unwilling or unable to distinguish between peaceful farmers and warriors. To them, all Apaches were the same, obstacles to be removed from the path of progress. A coyote called from somewhere in the distance, its voice lonely and wild. Chenoa opened her eyes and looked around the destroyed village one more time. The wickiups had been burned to ash, the sacred places defiled, the careful terraces where they'd grown their crops trampled into mud. She had 2 choices. She could lie down beside her grandmother's grave and let the rain wash her away, or she could honor Itzel's final words and find a place where the corn could grow. Chenoa stood on unsteady legs, swaying slightly from 3 days without food. She looked down at the seeds in her palm, 27 kernels of golden corn, each one a promise and a prayer. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "The corn is life. As long as they grow, we survive." She would find a place to plant them. Somehow, somewhere, she would honor her people's memory and ensure that the sacred corn continued to grow. Even if she was the last Apache woman in the world, she would keep the promise alive. The rain continued to fall as Chenoa gathered her few remaining possessions, a blanket, her grandmother's planting stick, and a small water gourd that had somehow survived the destruction. She took one last look at the burial mound, whispered a prayer in the language of her ancestors, and began walking north. toward the mountains where her grandmother had said the spirits of their people waited. She didn't know that 15 miles away, a half-Apache hunter named Joaquin Reyes was tracking deer through the same storm, following ancient trails his own grandmother had taught him. She didn't know that he was also searching for something, a connection to the Apache heritage his Mexican father had tried to beat out of him, a way to honor the memory of a mother who had died protecting the old ways. The rain fell harder, washing away Chenoa's footprints almost as quickly as she made them. But some paths are meant to cross, no matter how the wind blows or how hard the rain falls, and sometimes the most broken souls are the ones best suited to heal each other. Joaquin Reyes moved through the desert rain like a ghost, his moccasined feet finding purchase on slick rock where another man would slip and fall. At 28, he was known throughout the border country as the best tracker this side of the Rio Grande, a man who could find water in the driest season and follow trails that existed more in memory than on the ground. What the ranchers and settlers who'd hired him didn't know was that his tracking skills came from his Apache mother, Paloma, who had taught him to read the land like sacred text before his Mexican father discovered her lessons and ended them with his fists. "You are not an Indio," Manuel Reyes had raged when he caught 6-year-old Joaquin practicing the stalking techniques his mother had shown him. "You are Mexican. You will not shame this family with savage ways." The beating that followed had been severe, but not as devastating as watching his father drag his mother away to correct her thinking. Paloma had returned 3 days later, her spirit broken, her Apache pride buried beneath layers of fear and submission. She never taught Joaquin the old ways again, but she couldn't erase what she'd already given him, the ability to move silently through any terrain, to read tracks that others couldn't see, to understand the language that the land spoke to those willing to listen. These gifts had made him valuable to the very people who would have shot him on sight if they'd known his true heritage. Now, as Joaquin tracked a wounded deer through the storm, his thoughts turned to the news that had reached him 3 days ago. Apache settlement had been attacked by cavalry troops, wiped out completely, according to the reports, another piece of his mother's world erased from existence. The guilt aided him constantly. While he made his living serving the people who destroyed Apache communities, real Apaches were dying in the desert, hunted like animals for the crime of existing. He told himself he was surviving, adapting, doing what was necessary to live in a world that had no place for mixed-blood children. But late at night, when the wind howled through the canyons, he heard his mother's voice asking why he had abandoned the sacred trust she'd given him. The deer tracks he'd been following suddenly veered toward a rocky outcropping, and Joaquin frowned. The animal was more badly wounded than he'd thought, seeking shelter rather than continuing to run. He'd put it out of its misery quickly. There was no honor in letting anything suffer needlessly. But as he rounded the boulder, Joaquin stopped short. There was no deer. Instead, huddled against the rock face, was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 12 or 13, Apache by the look of her, soaked to the bone and shivering uncontrollably. Her buckskin dress was torn and stained, her long black hair plastered to her skull by the rain. But it was her hands that made Joaquin's heart stop. They were cupped protectively around something, held close to her chest as if her life depended on it. For a moment, neither of them moved. The girl's dark eyes met his, and Joaquin saw in them a depth of loss that made his own childhood trauma seem small by comparison. This wasn't just grief. This was the look of someone who had watched her entire world burn. Shimasani, she whispered, the Apache word for grandmother cutting through the rain like a prayer. Joaquin's throat tightened. She was calling him grandmother, mistaking him for someone safe in her delirium. How long had she been out here? How had she survived the massacre he'd heard about? Slowly, carefully, he lowered himself to her level, speaking in the Apache words his mother had taught him in secret. She Joaquin Yanishe. I will not hurt you. The girl's eyes widened at hearing her own language. She studied his face, taking in the mixed features that marked him as caught between two worlds, Apache cheekbones and eyes, but skin lightened by Spanish blood, and hair that fell in waves rather than the straight black of pure Apache heritage. "You speak the language of the people," she said in Apache, her voice barely audible over the rain. "My mother was Chiricahua," Joaquin replied, settling back on his heels. "What is your name, little sister?" "Chinoa. I am the last of my band. The soldiers came. Everyone is gone." Joaquin felt something break inside his chest. This child was truly alone, carrying the weight of an entire people's extinction. But she was alive, and she was here, and somehow their paths had crossed in this endless desert. "What do you carry?" he asked gently, nodding toward her hands. Chinoa opened her palm slowly, revealing the 27 kernels of corn. Even wet from the rain, they seemed to glow with inner light, each kernel perfect and whole. "Sacred corn. White mountain corn from my grandmother's grandmother's grandmother. She said as long as the corn grows, the people survive." Joaquin stared at the seeds, understanding flooding through him like lightning. This wasn't just corn, this was living history, genetic memory, the agricultural heritage of a people stretching back centuries. And this frightened, grieving child was its sole guardian. He thought of his mother's voice, teaching him plant lore in whispered Apache while his father worked in the fields. He thought of the sacred places she'd shown him, the hidden springs and protected valleys where the old plants still grew wild. He thought of the debt he owed to the ancestors he'd spent 20 years trying to forget. "She will grow here too," he said softly, the words coming from some deep place in his soul. "The corn will grow, and the people will survive." Chinoa looked up at him with eyes that held the faintest spark of hope. "Will you help me plant them?" Joaquin removed his worn leather jacket and wrapped it around the girl's shivering shoulders. For the first time in decades, he felt the presence of his mother's spirit, warm and approving. "Yes, little sister, I will help you plant them, and I will help you grow too." Joaquin's adobe house sat in a hidden valley, 3 hours' ride from where he'd found Chinoa, nestled against red sandstone cliffs that sheltered it from both winter winds and prying eyes. It was a place his mother had shown him as a child, back when she still dared to share the secret places of her people. For 2 weeks, Chinoa had been slowly healing, not just from exposure and hunger, but from the deeper wounds that came from being the sole survivor of genocide. Joaquin watched her careful movements around his small home, the way she startled at sudden sounds, how she checked the corn seeds multiple times each day to ensure they were safe. The girl spoke little, but when she did, it was in Apache. Joaquin found himself remembering words his mother had taught him, phrases and stories he'd buried so deep he'd thought they were lost forever. Speaking his mother's language again felt like breathing after years of holding his breath. "The corn needs ceremony," Chinoa said one morning as she sat by the window watching the sun rise over the desert. "Grandmother taught me the songs, but I am only one voice. The planting requires the voices of the women, the blessing of the elders." Joaquin set down his coffee cup and joined her at the window. In the growing light, he could see the small plot of land he'd been preparing, rich soil carried in baskets from the river bottom, carefully tilled and blessed with water from the sacred spring his mother had shown him. "Tell me about the ceremony. Perhaps we can find a way." Chinoa's face lit up for the first time since he'd found her. "Grandmother said the corn is planted when the moon is growing strong like the stalks will grow. First, we offer prayers to the 4 directions, asking for their blessing. Then the seeds are blessed with corn pollen and water from a sacred place." She paused, her expression growing troubled. "But the ceremony requires a woman to lead it, a grandmother or mother or aunt. I am just a child." "You carry the seeds," Joaquin said gently. "You are the keeper of the sacred corn. Perhaps that makes you woman enough for the ceremony." They planned the planting for the next new moon, 3 days away. Joaquin spent the time gathering what they would need: corn pollen from wild plants growing near the spring, sage for purification, red ochre to mark the sacred directions. Each item brought back memories of his mother's teachings, knowledge he'd thought lost forever. Chenoa, meanwhile, seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. The girl who had been found nearly dead in the rain was transforming before Joaquin's eyes, becoming something more than a survivor. She was becoming a keeper of traditions, a bridge between the old world and whatever came next. On the morning of the planting, they rose before dawn and walked to the prepared plot. Chenoa had spent the previous evening carefully preparing herself, braiding her hair with strips of sacred buckskin, painting her face with traditional designs she'd learned from her grandmother. "I am afraid," she admitted, as they stood at the edge of the plot. "What if I do something wrong? What if the ancestors are angry that a child tries to do woman's work?" Joaquin knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "The ancestors are not angry," he said. "They guided you to me, guided us to this place. They want the corn to grow as much as we do." Together, they began the ceremony. Chenoa's young voice rose in ancient songs as she faced each direction, offering prayers in Apache that had been spoken over corn plantings for countless generations. Joaquin found himself remembering fragments of the melodies, his voice joining hers in harmonies his mother had hummed while she worked. When it came time to bless the seeds, Chenoa's hands shook as she took the corn pollen. "I wish grandmother was here," she whispered. "She is here," Joaquin said softly. "In the songs you sing, in the knowledge you carry, in every seed you plant. The ancestors live on through us." One by one, they placed the 27 seeds in the carefully prepared holes, each one blessed with pollen and water, each one a prayer for survival and continuity. As the sun rose higher, painting the desert in shades of gold and red, the last seed was covered with earth. "Now we wait," Chenoa said, sitting back on her heels. "And we tend them. Grandmother said the corn needs songs and stories to grow strong." Over the following weeks, they established a routine. Each morning, Chenoa would visit the corn plot, singing to the growing plants in Apache, telling them stories of their ancestors, sharing the oral history that lived in her memory. Joaquin would work nearby, maintaining the irrigation channels he dug from the spring, protecting the young plants from insects and animals. Slowly, miraculously, green shoots began to emerge from the earth. Chenoa wept the first time she saw them, tiny fingers of life reaching toward the sun, proof that her people's legacy would continue. "They're growing," she said, wonder in her voice. "The sacred corn is growing." Joaquin watched her tend the plants with the devotion of a priestess, saw how she spoke to each stalk individually, how she sang them the old songs every morning and evening. This child was doing more than growing corn. She was keeping an entire culture alive through sheer force of will and love. But as the corn grew taller, Joaquin began to worry about the future. What would happen when people discovered Chenoa, when they learned that an Apache girl was living in his hidden valley, practicing the old ways? The authorities would take her away, place her in one of the government schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man. He couldn't let that happen. Somehow, he had to find a way to protect not just Chenoa, but the sacred knowledge she carried. The corn might be growing, but the real test would be ensuring that it and she could survive in a world that wanted both erased from existence. As Joaquin watched Chenoa sing to the corn in the fading light, he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He would do more than protect her. He would help her plant seeds of Apache culture throughout the Southwest, hidden in places where they could grow in secret until the world was ready to accept them again. The corn, was just the beginning. 3 months after the planting, the corn stood tall and proud in the hidden valley, the golden tassels catching the morning light like prayers made visible. Chenoa moved between the stalks with the reverence of a pilgrim in a cathedral, checking each ear for ripeness, singing the harvest songs her grandmother had taught her. Joaquin watched from the shade of the ramada he'd built, marveling at the transformation in both the girl and himself. Chenoa had grown taller, stronger, her face no longer carrying the haunted look of a survivor, but the quiet confidence of a keeper of sacred knowledge. And he had found something he'd thought lost forever: connection to his Apache heritage, purpose beyond mere survival. The corn had not just grown, it had thrived. Despite the harsh desert conditions, the sacred seeds had produced a full harvest, each ear heavy with kernels that seemed to glow with inner fire. But more than that, word of their success had begun to spread through the hidden networks that connected the scattered Apache peoples. 2 weeks ago, an elderly woman named Maria Sandoval had appeared at their valley, walking alone across 30 miles of desert. She was Mescalero Apache, one of the few who still remember the old ways, and she had come seeking the girl who grew the sacred corn. I heard whispers, she had told them, her ancient eyes bright with hope. Stories of a child who saved the White Mountain corn, who speaks the old language and knows the ceremonies. I have granddaughters who need to learn these things. Since then, others had come. A young mother with 2 small daughters, desperate to pass on the Apache language before it died with her generation. An old man who knew songs but had no one to sing them to. A teenage boy who dreamed of learning the warrior ways but had only government schools to teach him how to be ashamed of his heritage. The Hidden Valley had become a sanctuary, a place where Apache culture could grow as surely as the sacred corn. Joaquin found himself serving as protector and translator, using his knowledge of both worlds to keep their activities secret from the authorities while helping preserve traditions that existed nowhere else. "The harvest moon is coming," Chenoa announced as she emerged from the corn with an armload of perfect ears. "Grandmother always said the corn should be gathered under the full moon, when the spirits are strongest." Joaquin nodded, though part of him worried about the increased activity in their valley. More Apache families were arriving each week, drawn by stories of the girl who had saved the sacred corn. It was what they'd hoped for, but it was also dangerous. The more people who knew about their sanctuary, the greater the risk of discovery. That evening, as the full moon rose over the desert, the small community gathered for the harvest ceremony. Chenoa, now recognized as the keeper of the sacred corn, led the proceedings with a confidence that belied her 14 years. She had grown into her role as culture bearer, speaking with the authority of someone who carried the voices of ancestors in her words. The harvest itself was performed with ancient ritual. Each ear cut with ceremonies of thanksgiving, each kernel treated as a sacred gift. As the corn was gathered, the people shared stories of their own families, their losses, their hopes for the future. "My grandmother used to make a tole from corn like this," said Maria, holding a perfect ear up to the moonlight. "She said it would give strength to nursing mothers, wisdom to growing children." "The pollen can be gathered for ceremonies," added the old man, Santos. "My father was a medicine man. He taught me how to prepare it properly." As the night wore on, Joaquin realized they were witnessing something remarkable: the rebirth of Apache culture from the seeds of near extinction. The harvest had become more than agricultural success. It was cultural renaissance, sparked by one brave girl who had refused to let her people's legacy die. But their success had not been unnoticed by the outside world. "They found us," he told Chenoa, who was grinding corn in the traditional way Maria had taught her. The girl looked up, fear flickering in her eyes for just a moment before being replaced by determination. "The corn is safe," she said, gesturing to the dozens of seed ears they had carefully preserved. "We have given seeds to 7 families. Even if they destroy this place, the sacred corn will survive." Joaquin felt a surge of pride at her courage, but also terror at what was coming. He had no legal right to shelter Apache refugees, no authority to operate what the government would see as an illegal school. And Chenoa, she would be taken to a government boarding school, her hair cut, her language forbidden, her culture stripped away piece by piece. "There is another way," said Maria, who had been watching the approaching riders with eyes that had seen too much government treachery. "The river crossing, if we can reach Mexico." "No," Chenoa said firmly. "Running is not the answer. The corn grows here now. This is where it belongs." When the officials reached the valley, they found exactly what they expected: an illegal gathering of Apache people, practicing forbidden traditions, teaching children things the government had spent decades trying to erase. But they also found something they didn't expect: an articulate, educated girl who spoke to them in perfect English and defended her right to preserve her culture. "This corn represents 800 years of Apache agricultural knowledge," Chenoa told the stern-faced Indian agent. "It contains genetic variations that could help feed hungry people throughout the Southwest. You would destroy that because you fear our prayers?" Joaquin watched with amazement as this young woman, for that was what she had become, faced down government authority with a courage that would have impressed the greatest Apache warriors. She spoke of heritage and science, of legal rights and human dignity, weaving arguments that the officials had never encountered from an Apache child. In the end, it was not the strength of her arguments that saved them, but the presence of a young anthropologist named Dr. Elizabeth Harris, who had come with the officials to document Apache extinction for her research. Instead, she found herself witnessing the preservation of priceless cultural knowledge by a remarkable young woman. "This girl is protecting genetic and cultural resources that are scientifically invaluable," Dr. Harris argued to the Indian agent. "Shutting this down would be not just cruel, but academically irresponsible." The negotiations that followed lasted 3 days. In the end, a compromise was reached. The valley would be recognized as a cultural preservation site operating under the supervision of the Smithsonian Institution. Chenoa would continue her education, but also serve as a cultural consultant, helping to document and preserve Apache traditions. It wasn't perfect. There would be restrictions, oversight, bureaucratic interference, but the corn would continue to grow. The ceremonies would continue, and Apache children would still have a place to learn the old ways. On the last night before the officials left, Joaquin found Chenoa sitting among the corn stalks, singing softly in Apache. The plants rustled around her in the evening breeze, as if they were singing along. "Do you think grandmother would be proud?" she asked. Joaquin sat beside her, looking up at the stars that had guided Apache people for countless generations. "I think she knows that her seeds found the right place to grow and that they produced exactly the harvest she hoped for." Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, and the desert wind carried the scent of growing corn and the sound of Apache songs into the night. The sacred corn had taken root, and with it the promise that as long as there were people willing to tend them, the old ways would never truly die.